So for everybody, it was one of those characters that don't need no introduction, but Brette Steele is currently the dean of the School of Arts, Media, Architecture, multiple departments under him in UCLA. Before that, he was a director for many, many years in the Architectural Association. Is a dear, dear friend, one of the most interesting and funny thinkers in the world of architecture. So it's always fun. It's always a pleasure to have him to join us in conversation in SCI-Arc. What we're going to do today is something I'm intrigued a little bit, because it's a little bit more like something that happens in other forms of it. Brette is going to revisit a talk that he did exactly more or less 5 years ago in SCI-Arc. It was one of the first things we did when I became the director of the school. We initiated a series, which we still do every semester on and off, called Duels and Duets, in which two architects talk, and they don't know if they're a duel or a duet. And Brette was the very first one on the subject, and he was the one who tried to give an interesting frame to it. So I asked him to repeat. I'm pretty sure that he tweaked it and changed it a little bit, but to revisit that, because again, this is something that we don't have the opportunity to do regularly, to go back and revisit the lecture and do it again 5 years later. I mean, and I think since we are in this upside down world and extraordinary times, seems like an interesting experiment to do. And since we are recording and broadcasting this, maybe for you and me, Brette, later in another day to do a post game to revisit both of the talks and to see how much it changed and how much remained the same. It will be an interesting experiment for somebody to do. So without further ado, I give the Zoom floor to Brette Steele directly from his garage, not the kitchen. The kitchen is not available to him because he's been taken by the family. So he's been in exile in the garage. Which is a very LA, California thing to do, I would say, if Steve Jobs and Bill Gates serves as a good president. So Brette, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Hernán, thank you for that generous introduction. Can you all, first of all, first things first, can you hear me? Is the audio okay? I have a family who keep telling me that I'm speaking too loudly into computers, which makes me feel like I'm like 90 years old. So I'm hoping this is okay. Yeah, I'm between a deep freezer on one side and a treadmill on the other on a sawhorse in a garage. And my social media people in the office hate the fact that this plug keeps appearing in our videos. So I'll try and hide it briefly for you. It usually has like 27 things plugged into it. Yeah, this is a weird format. And given that the title of this talk way back 1,000 years ago in 2015 was called Duel and Duet or something like that, at the time that Hernán launched a conversational series in the school, it was a topic that I'd been thinking about quite a lot for about 10 years up to that point. And so put together this short piece that I'll show you today. And I promise the only thing I've done to it since that, and I lost that talk and another 450 when I moved to LA when a hard drive went missing on a long haul flight out of Heathrow. So I had no memory of this talk, just to say up front. Hernán was able to send me the keynote file. I saw it, and the only thing I did was knock out a lot of images to get to the point. So that's the extent of my, my editing. But I do like this idea of a past tense. And the idea of going back and revisiting a lecture, like going back and revisiting a project 5 years later, is kind of the definition of architectural knowledge. So I really have no problem with that as a topic. In fact, it's almost the definition of what I take to be the most durable building material of the 20th century, which is the architectural monograph that's invented in the early years of the 20th century and industrialized by people like Frank Lloyd Wright and then Le Corbusier. And what the monograph does more than anything is focus architectural minds on this idea of going back and looking at something a few years later and trying to make sense of it. The title for this talk was very much taken, if I'm remembering right, Hernán, from the sort of series that you put together and launched about this time in LA called Duels and Duets, and sort of mirrored a thing that we had running for many years in London called This versus That. And I'm going to show you a few images of that. What I became very interested in was how awkward architects were on a stage when they had to share that stage with other architects. Something few of us are actually prepared to do, particularly in an era of PowerPoint sensibilities. So, okay, let's see if this works. So the two obvious scenarios here is the idea of, on the one hand, one architect coming after another architect, and it being a kind of battle between generations, probably epitomized in the mid-20th century by a figure like Philip Johnson in relation to Mies van der Rohe, which I'll talk about later. Versus this sort of a scenario, the duet scenario, in which that thing we do is understood as fundamentally the thing that we share with either partners or a collaborative team, or in an intergenerational sense amongst our peers that captures a moment. And both of those are kind of caricatures of the history of architectural history itself, but the putting together of this talk for me became a chance to try and question that very simple narrative of either or, and things being either duels or duets, sorry. I landed in LA in 2015, soon after I had been managing the third installment of one of those duels that I'd been holding for several years with Mark Wigley, who at the time was the dean of GSAP in Columbia, in a series that he and I launched about 5 years before called Nylon, New York and London. And we were very interested at the time in resurrecting a kind of Cold War North Atlantic treaty alliance between two great capitals, one in Europe and one in North America, and which of course quickly devolved into exactly the kind of story of those two cities for the better part of a century. This was one of the posters for that series, which happened to be the year in which both Mark and I broke our left foot by coincidence. And one of the topics that ran through that series for several years was our revisiting for the first time in about 25 years, a project that he and I undertook in 1989, the year we met in New York, where we tried to establish something called the Institute of Failure, which was a school that was going to teach students how to fail in architecture, and which was covered by Progressive Architecture and a couple of other magazines that year, when in fact we found ourselves unable to attract even a single student to the program. Although we wrote reference letters for many of them who went on to distinguished careers. So one of the things that I found in that series over several years, of course, was the expected antagonism that should exist between deans and schools about their various pedagogical styles and programs. And like this sort of an image from Stanley Kubrick's great Barry Lyndon film from several years before, that kind of carefully scripted dual battle, some of you will now know from Hamilton, is of course a part of this idea of what it means to create a debate or a discussion within a field, i.e. that it's largely choreographed and scripted from the very beginning. The other thing that I shared with the audience that year at SCI-Arc was that I was just coming off of this event at the Oxford Debate Union, which is probably the citadel of scripted debates that exist between figures. And in addition to being honored by the fact that I could give a presentation in a room that had invited Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Johnny Depp, what I was really struck by at the end, of course, was the highly choreographed expectation that two sides are always even in some way, and that a debate is a kind of act of civil or public presentation and gesture, which I also found, I think I've got a video here of this, as I was flying over that day to LA from London, this incredible 13-hour debate was playing out in 2015. And just to show you the British commitment to this idea of debate, look at this clip by the Prime Minister at the time.
Particularly in Stoke, where the potteries community, I wish the Shadow Chancellor would occasionally shut up and listen to the answer.
Sorry, let me see if I can get back to it so you can see the.
particularly in Stoke, where the potteries community. I wish the Shadow Chancellor would occasionally shut up and listen to the answer.
Order! Other members can now follow the Prime Minister's advice to the Shadow Chancellor. We need a bit of order. The Prime Minister.
I may be alone in finding him the most annoying person in modern politics, but anyway, I'm sure, no, I think, I've got a feeling the Leader of the Opposition will one day agree with me, but there we are. Right, where were we? In potteries, yes. Look, clearly, there are massive...
So this was a short clip from a 13-hour debate that the Prime Minister was holding that day with the opposition party around an incredibly important initiative, the person that led to the Brexit vote only about a year or year and a half later that sent me and many other foreign nationals away from the UK. He was also the Prime Minister that announced in 2011 during a visit to the Obama White House that he would eliminate 90% of overseas students in the UK, which he successfully delivered over about a 3-year period. And I think more than anything, what it makes me think about looking back and reflecting upon this moment is, of course, that any idea that we might have of debates or duels within disciplines are highly choreographed within a set of constrained rules and forms of engagement. And of course, it's the unraveling of those in recent years that have led to precisely the collapse of civic and public space that we know it in so many ways that we all have to deal with today. Duels as one extreme on a spectrum, if duels are nothing but agreed upon rules for matching weapons and practicing skill or technique in highly controlled areas where there are winners and losers. Duets, by the other hand, are forms of composition and making that also adhere at times to highly controlled rules, but are interesting for becoming their own kind of art form in and of themselves. And I guess what we were discussing that evening and talking about is how that sliding scale between these two things might exist as ways of imagining where particularly public space, but a discipline like architecture might be today. And I've already set it up in a way like the title of Hernán's terrific series as a kind of dialectic between these two sort of models. And I guess the only proviso up front that I was trying to offer is this observation that Wittgenstein makes late in his philosophy career, which is, of course, that it's precisely the dialectic nature of everyday language that is our challenge to try and overcome. So, and the extreme form of that, even by 2015, was to understand the forms of relativism that had swept already across a field like architecture from the 1980s onward, in which anything was up and available and ready to go and available for meaning, the revenge of which was, of course, recent national politics, particularly in a place like the United States, and almost the entire collapse, you could say, of any sense of nuance in meaning at all, which is something we've all been living through in recent years. This terrific paper by Kieran Healy I shared with the audience that evening was a sort of high watermark of that realization that the sort of nuance and ambiguity, you could say, of a postmodernist stance in the 1980s had completely collapsed by about 2015 or the early part of this century. And a figure like Healy makes the case, and this is an academic, by the way, that as a member of Duke University is living in the heart of a place like postmodernism, where Frederick Jameson and others invented the idea of cultural relativism. But as he says in this paper at the outset, and you can see his abstract up at the top, which is just to do away with the very idea of an academic abstract at all in a paper, is that, as he says, I shall argue that for problems facing sociology at present, demanding more nuance typically obstructs the development of theory that is intellectually interesting, empirically generative, or practically successful. And in other words, throwing the idea of a postmodernist nuance away entirely and embracing instead the radical potential of dialectics. something that John Woo gave us a great cinematic version of in the end of the 1990s, but which is a cinematic version is considerably different than the realities of trying to put a new face on a living human being. This is the example that I think many of you might have seen several years ago of a person that received a face transplant. And on the left is that person after the first 100 surgeries that were involved in the putting of that face on that person. So with that as a setup, what I was turning to was really this question of how we might think of a disciplinary antagonism sitting within architecture over the last 50 years, especially for me. By the late 1960s, as the original pioneers of a modernist movement are fast failing and fading away, a generation appears on the scene in the 60s and early 1970s, which carry their own kind of interesting antagonistic potentials, you could say, but also are pursuing careers that are in fact the result of very close contact between one another. In the case of Rem Koolhaas, having nearly failed at the Architectural Association and pitching up in New York in the 1970s in Peter Eisenman's Institute, one of the most interesting features for me of their career is that they had never, until this evening that I took this photograph in 2009, sat down together on a stage to talk about how their careers unfolded alongside that of other architectural careers of their or proximate generations. And one of the things that Rem leaned over and told me as we were beginning this evening, when I put the two of them on stage and introduced them at the time for having had a combined 147 years in architecture and not appear together on a stage, is that he wanted me to make very clear that he was not of the same generation as Peter Eisenman. That event was probably the first one to traumatize for me this question of how it is an architect might talk about his or her career in relation to other architects. I used this event to launch what we called in London the This versus That series of lectures over the next 10 years that brought together two unexpected combatant conversation around not just their own work, but that of the other person on stage. That particular evening, which did not go particularly well, I have to say, because nobody quite knew what to say about the other person next to them, was captured 3 years later in that small green book in the center of the screen called Supercritical, which was an extended rumination that I published in 2012 over the isolation of those two careers and yet the strange parallels that you can see exist between the two. And of course, to visit that event is to also remind ourselves of the 100 years of that kind of antagonism that you could say has driven, if not the realities of architectural practice, at least its narrative historical accounts. This image is probably as famous for not just being the singular shot that combines Mies and Korbes together into one photograph, but also for its airbrushed rendition that got rid of the lower tier European modernists that happened to be in the picture at the same time that photograph was taken when Mies was planning the Wiesenhof-Siedlung in Germany that year. So, you know, one way to think of that kind of an architectural history is to remind ourselves of how that narrative structure drives storytelling of all kinds. And that's what got me to the sort of second half of the talk, which was to really talk about the strange, not just some of the strange parallels and forms of outright competition that you could say exist in select episodes, like, for example, Philip Johnson's taking of Mies van der Rohe's ideas in 1946 for the purposes of launching his own career. And to remind you, Philip organized that first ever retrospective of Mies that year in New York at exactly the moment Philip was launching his own office in New York City. And as he said, he had no idea what to do, and what better resource than to get 40 years of Mies van der Rohe's own work to begin that work. But of course, alongside that, what we see is the expectation still that there's a kind of interdisciplinary account for what we think of as architectural history or practice. And looking back on this talk a few years later, the only thing I would say from the vantage of my my new position, in which architecture is simply one of four very different creative fields in which they work, what I find probably most compelling is to think of the way in which this kind of a story is less about individuals within a given profession or field in our generation today, or in the 21st century when fields are becoming so radically collaborative and interactive, that narrative becomes for me far more interesting when we think of how fields themselves duel or collaborate between themselves. But anyway, back to the sad 2015 version of these thoughts. I think what I focused on, and I won't go into it in any detail here, are the very specific examples in which the outright antagonism, professional or personal, that sits between certain individuals proved to be, in fact, an incredible creative driver. Sometimes those are antagonisms. At other times, those are incredible friendships that might exist between individuals in a field. Sometimes, as is the case with this sort of a photograph of Mies van der Rohe at the time in which he was trying to get Jackie Kennedy to commission him to do the Kennedy Memorial in Boston. Those are a kind of imagined set of relationships that drive creative work. At the time in which Peter Eisenman invites Rem to New York, one of the most interesting outcomes of that becomes not the alliance formed between the expected architectural friendships, like Rem and Peter Eisenman, or between Peter and Rem or Colin Rowe, so much as this sort of a photograph of Rem having an opportunity in 1972 to encounter one of his heroes, the forgotten by that time late modernist Wallace K. Harrison, whose, of course, invention of Rockefeller Center becomes such a seminal part of the book that Rem would publish 5 or 6 years later called Delirious New York. And what that for me in this talk became a segue into was really just this idea of architects' work talking across decades and generations in sometimes surprising and sometimes productive ways. If you squint and close your eyes and don't look at the image on the right for a minute, on the left is a page, a spread from SML XL, like page 1280 of a 1400 page book. I'm sure we didn't get there in the end, but weirdly, in the proposal that OMA made in 1995 for a district in Paris, that's Rem Koolhaas's left hand above the city, lifting up a layer of a spectacularly horizontal project that OMA was focusing on, which when I found it was most striking for me for the contrast it presented to the right hand of Le Corbusier, published 60 years earlier in Le Corbusier's book on urbanism, that also uses Paris as a backdrop for a vertical city. And of course, the tower that the unit was proposing at the time. Sometimes those contacts are less disciplinary and more personal. This is a very scary Norman Foster leering over a 104-year-old Oscar Niemeyer at a time in which they're both roughly the same age, but they had a good 2 centuries of work in them at that time. But I think one of the amazing things about the small world that we think of as architecture is the incredible connections that simply exist across our field in a world where they're just at the end of the day, despite the size of the profession today, there aren't that many individuals involved. In fact, one of the hardest games to play in architecture is that game we all know of as 6 degrees of separation, in which you can relate everybody within a field over 6 layers to one another. In architecture, what I find stunning is that usually about 2 or 3 layers maximum. So in these 2 quotes, you could say two extreme versions of this idea of influence within a field. The well-known canonical view of Harold Bloom and the anxiety of influence, that one of the first jobs of artists is to write their own history, you could say, and There are times at which, particularly in the 20th century, that task has been left to the professionals who write histories and criticism. But the point made by Mark Rakitansky, whose writings I published a few years ago, the point that Mark makes early on in one of his essays, of course, is that architects don't just make things, they make things up. And of course, one of the spectacular things that they continue to make up brilliantly is the idea of architectural history itself, which you can see that I'm riffing off of here in various ways. So the picture on the right of one of my teachers in London, a fellow named Cedric Price, who very consciously adopts a very different figure of the architect 500 years after that very constructive view of Andrea Palladio in the 16th century, is simply re-inhabiting one of the most enduring traits of architectural knowledge itself, which is that our first and foremost project is the construction of that figure we think of as the architect. And one of the most effective ways by which we pursue that project remains, of course, our study, our careful study and calculation of other architects that we will then contrast ourselves to. So, however radical the 20th century is to the arrival of the Renaissance, which you will remember started with Leonardo drawing not just a man, but an architect. In the only existing text from antiquity, which happened to be a series of 10 scrolls on architecture, whose rediscovery in the 15th century becomes the beginning of the Renaissance. One of the most compelling things is, of course, how several centuries later, that figure of the architect still figures so prominently in the work of Lissitzky and so many others in their definition of what a new sort of space-time era might be. Something that you could say has been dramatically accelerated with the arrival in recent years of the technologies that allow for the making of a backdrop like this one. This is Natasha Sandmeyer's studio in London, which was made several years ago. Sorry, I don't see the date here. But that is Natasha and her students sitting in front of their sources of inspiration and criticism for that year, those figures in the back that the students worked on throughout the year, several of whom I think you'll probably recognize, and most of whom would require an hour-long presentation to try and make sense of. But of course, what becomes so interesting in recent years is how the platforms and technologies that allow the construction of that sort of relationship between us and our forebears becomes so open to reinvention and sits not just in a literary or historical or written space so much as a radically visual one, as platforms like Photoshop and other things have opened up. I got nothing to say about this 2010 image. And I'm not sure why it was there, other than maybe, sorry, on the left, this was a shot taken a year that we were editing the essays of Denise Scott Brown, who's in the center of this image and the only person important in it by far. We were collecting together Denise's essays that year for a first time into a small $5 book that she assured anybody would be able to afford forever. And as we started that conversation, Cool House came in and wanted to talk about the ways in which the experience at Las Vegas played in his confidence and ability to leap to a place like Manhattan, i.e. to that part of the known architecture world that made no sense at the time. He chose to do that in much the same way that Denise did in 1969 when she convinced Bob Venturi on the left there to do something unexpected and that he said he was truly horrified by, which is go to the first city in the world that was built, as I think some of you know, based on a television program and offer a very different kind of urbanism than he had been trained to try and understand before. So in closing, I just got a few images, and what I tried to get to in the talk was the idea of saying, instead of thinking of it just a series of duels or duets, which is an almost over-schematized or oversimplified relationship of two bodies or two figures or two ideas in space, what I became much more interested in is a series of sort of intermediate terms, like frenemies, i.e. people you can't tell if they're friends or foe. and the role that might play in our thinking. Or multiplicities, like this kind of a figure. This is a terrific image that Marcel Duchamp made in the early 20th century through a clever staging of cameras and mirrors, where in fact what he was doing was multiplying himself several times within one space and trying to make the case, as Deleuze and Guattari would several decades later in their book on Anti-Oedipus, make the case that multiplicities are far more productive for the mistakes that are made in that than on the singular errors or successes. Or the idea of seconds or straw men or dummies as a kind of figure. This is one of the architects that I interviewed with originally at the AA when I went to it. On the left is Mark Fisher, one of the great unknown and I think unrecognized geniuses of late 20th century architecture. He was a unit master at the AA, and when we went in to interview with him to gain acceptance to his studios, one of the uncanny things he did is he created a dummy of himself that you had to talk to during the interview to gain acceptance into the studio. I was totally freaked out and ran away. Like, it was just too unnerving for words. But Mark's point, of course, was that to enter his unit, which was called the Nice Ideas unit in the school, to enter his studio was to not enter the world of Mark Fisher at all, but to enter your own world in a platform that would support you with your own ideas and work. And what he was obviously trying to do was to break one of the strongest tendencies of 20th century architectural education, which is we go to studios to learn to copy the people that teach those studios. And Mark was absolutely brilliant at that project. Mark Fisher, for those of you that don't know, was the architect that invented the idea of stadium rock and roll. His only clients from the time he graduated in the 1970s until he died sadly a few years ago were figures like Mick Jagger, Elton John, U2, and Pink Floyd, which were his clients for his first project. And what he was interested in was a kind of event space that had nothing to do with fixed permanent buildings. Another term that I thought might be useful to try and break the dual and duet would be like so many things in life, the lessons that Andy Warhol offered us, which is, of course, to imagine not just that would support his own work, but that, of course, become the source of his own emulation within the studio. Andy was famous for not just his own forms of self-improvement and change. Remember, this is an artist who spent his life wearing masks and wigs to try and not be himself in galleries and other spaces, but of course to hire people who would outdo his own personality and presence within those studios. And then the final example was, and this coincided simply with the timing of Hernán's invitation to SCI-Arc, which is, of course, all of these are just storytelling examples in different ways. And I used that one simply because this was what was launching at the time of my arrival in LA. And one reason to come to LA is obviously because you get to see the movies before they get to everywhere else. And so all of these questions within architecture, I guess, for me, became a way to revisit the larger ways in which architecture is itself a kind of victim of other preconceptions and cultural expectations around combat, battle, generational change, and all of those tropes that we used to, at least until the last month, spend so much time and money in dark rooms watching. And of all the quotes I have from Cedric Price over the years in London that he shared, for me, the most compelling one was something he said after a lecture to me one evening when he explained that his distrust of theater was precisely the result as an architect of the fact that theaters are places where 300 strangers go into a room to sit in the dark and watch an ending that you already know before it gets there. Which is why he said he would never do a cinema. And it at least in light of what we face today, seems like a really insightful view of the expectations we have around public space. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Brett. If you stop sharing your screen, you will see again the mosaic of people.
Yep.
This is the part that also we invite whoever was watching in YouTube to join us for the conversation part if they choose to do so.
Nice.
So a silent applause. So to get the ball rolling, as I always says, everybody feel free to chime in with questions in the chat or ask directly. I think we have like 30 something people in it, so I think it's manageable. But you can use the chat. I'm happy to read the questions to Brett. But maybe to get the ball rolling, and I think with the last series of slides, I think you give us a lot of clues about different possible scenarios, which I always find the most productive thing to move forward. But the one I want to ruminate a little bit on the notion of, I mean, part of the notion of duels and duets was in my head, and your take was a fascinating one. But in my take was a simple, it was kind of a one that I was being fascinated by the simplicity of it, which is, in the context of an academic discussion, usually two architects tend to be much more friendly and be able to be a duet, that they will be in private about the practice of the design of the other one, which is always a duel. So I always been kind of intrigued and to a certain extent obsessed with this notion of almost holy war between architects or different architecture, almost religious, like my architecture is better than yours and so on. And always been built the antagonism model. And particularly, I would argue in the Anglo-Saxon, because somebody who, like me, who was originally not educated in Anglo-Saxon culture, but then is the one I operate in the academic one, the idea of the critical project or the critical thinking was something I never heard until I moved to New York. The idea that you will build notion by the notion of criticality, the idea that you build a project by criticizing something else. So I would like to hear more about what do you think is all. It seems to be that that seems to be the most common trend, the notion of antagonism, of dispute, of the lack of collaboration in this, the different ethos of how every architect sees their own architecture or their own vision of architecture. Even though I think, as I said, you give us clues about how to avoid that. But nevertheless, it seems that we keep coming back in the trap and we always keep revisiting these things.
Yeah, no,
if that makes any sense.
No, thanks. I'd love to hear actually from you all on that front. I would agree that the idea of the critical project as it was first articulated, which you could say drove late modern theory in many different fields, and architecture was often taking from those theories, particularly in literature, but in other fields as well, through the closure of the 20th century, was a phenomenon. It was a real thing. I think it was predicated on the idea of there being enough of a shared, I would argue about there being enough of a shared language and set of touchstones and projects that one could position ourselves in relation to those projects. I think, you know, the spectacularly interesting thing for a generation of students and young architects today is, of course, those touchstones no longer exist, or you know, maybe a more generous way to describe that would be to say that the vehicles or the platforms for the critical project now live in worlds like Instagram or likes or things that defy the sort of literary habits and routines of previous generations. I find that incredibly liberating. More than anything, though, it seems like as we live each year deeper into a world in which there are no longer a set of shared facts at all, but rather a series of different narrative structures that can now overwhelm any kind of fact-based evidence, you know, it opens up for me as a kind of creative or critical project, you know, an incredible focus we should all be putting on that project in our own careers and ideas. You know, we're well past the era in which you know, Jean Baudrillard might write that the model or the stories overwhelm reality. There is now no shared coherent reality that that becomes a touchstone for things like curricula, pedagogies, projects within schools. I see it as it's hard for me to not see that as a certain kind of loss, I guess, but that was probably just my own habits for many, many years, and being the product of a generation in which we actually all studied a fairly carefully choreographed list of other projects or histories, out of which we tried to then complete our own. But I'd much rather hear from the students, especially on that front, than anything someone like me could say about it.
Okay. I have a question for you from Alejandro. Thanks for the conversation. What do you think is the role of institution as a geographical location to harness these sets of multiplicities, frenemies, duets, etc., taking into account that in today's world, a lot of our influences, especially during quarantine, come within the expansive field of the internet?
Well, that's tough. Thank you. Thanks, Alejandro. I think I think part of the struggles we're going through definitely do touch on geography. And I think I can remember a pitch I made in first coming to LA 2.5 years ago, that to me, one of the most compelling parts of this particular place, which by the way, I think will never have a critical project, or rather if it does, we'll never notice it because the traffic is terrible. You know, that one of the most compelling parts of this particular geography is that LA finds itself sitting almost equidistant between two East Coasts of a very different nature. The sort of familiar one that LA has always been insecure about, which is the East Coast of the United States. But I think if you contrast that with the East Coast of Asia right now, one of the remarkable things is how this place sits right in the intersection of both of those spaces. I can't imagine geography mattering more right now than it does. The internet is a piece of geography. I think you all have seen the maps that show where and how it's distributed in the world. I don't think we should try and divorce that geography and that infrastructure from the political and social geography that we all now inhabit. We're all going to have to learn to imagine space in a very different way. For previous generations, and it's been theorized to great effect by generations of architectural historians, but it's been argued since at least the time of Siegfried Gideon's first great kind of encyclopedic histories of modern architecture, that space and the production of space was the driver of what we think of as the arrival of modern architecture. What we're living through is obviously the succession of space to interface. It isn't that interface is of a different order and of a different kind than space, but just the very platform of this kind of an event tonight reminds us that our preconceptions, our habits, our expectations around interface are going to be defining the production of knowledge and not just projects in new and just even on an hourly and daily basis right now, especially in unimaginable ways. By the way, I like that idea of interface versus space as one of the great duels of our time, particularly for a discipline like ours that has for so long biased itself towards space and its making. The making of physical space and the arrangement of cities, urbanism and all of that. I think the history of monographs for me at least provides some sort of a touchstone to the idea of interfaces and how knowledge and experience in architecture travels through different media have been fundamental to that sort of a project as well. I think as others have written already, you know, one of the peculiarities of modern architecture is that it arrives precisely at the moment of modern media itself, the industrialized magazine, the printing press, the early arrival of commercial photography, you know, all of those sort of things suggest that there's a much deeper, let's say, interconnection between space and interface than we've been willing to concede in our own work.
Okay, we have one from Ming Fan.
Hey, Ming.
Brette. She asking, do you think the location, in this case Los Angeles, as you refer to, has changed your view on the notion of criticality?
I think it definitely has in terms of being on freeways. I've never owned a car until I arrived here, so my entire worldview is upside down right now. I think, in all seriousness, for me, the critical project is something that already that was already re-examined, you could say, with the arrival of a kind of information space, and particularly digital and software platforms that for 20 years have really driven thinking within the field. So for me, that the arrival in LA didn't have near the impact as the arrival of Microsoft Windows in the 1990s on that question of a critical project. I think to try and keep up with architectural theory really became a battle with user manuals and software manuals and published books as much as anything. I suppose the one thing that coming to LA for me did, which was incredible and is still incredibly jarring, and I haven't yet fully navigated, is to work with a department of incredibly talented architects, faculty, and students alongside other creative fields, 3 other fields, including performance, art, and digital or computational design, all of whom have incredibly different attitudes about things like this lecture or juries or presentations. And it made me, I guess, realize in ways I hadn't fully appreciated how much I was a creature of habits also. To give you one example, even the dean is not allowed into end of quarter juries with fine art students, for the extent to which we as an outsider can contaminate that project, as that MFA student, after 2 years of working with Kathy Opie or Larry Pittman, is preparing their career for the art world, which is so rapacious, indiscriminate, and random that the idea of a rational, coherent conversation or discussion in a public space would be totally out of order. And in fact, in that kind of a field, one of the things I'm really struck by is the extent to which faculty see their job as solely protecting that space for MFA students over the 2 or 3 years they're there, before they then have to go out and on their own do all of that stuff that we in architecture schools assume we need to do to help those students.
Hey, Brett, we have another question from Jesse. Hi, Brett, thanks for the great words about interface. I wanted to also mention your point about the role of architecture in the human subject. Do you think we could also speak about the architecture school as the interface for the construction of the human subject?
I guess we could. I don't know how, but yeah, you would hope at almost any level. Sorry, I wish I could see people. I don't see you, Jesse. I'm looking here. Wait.
Use if you can use this gallery view.
I am.
Jesse's there saying hi.
Hey, Jesse. No, I mean, I touched on it in this talk, but I do think the central project of any architecture school isn't the making of buildings or design projects. It's the making of one figure, the figure of the architect. We just hide that in things we call curricula and pedagogy. Your job is to replace us. There's like I can remember this horrible joke that Seinfeld told. You know, he has kids late in life, and he says, you know, he finally has a baby and he's holding it up and he's realizing, like, I love this thing to death. And then you realize their job is to replace you. Like, that is the job of students. And if a school has any obligation right now in a world of radical technological, social media, mediated knowledge and experience at all, it's for schools to learn from students and not the other way around. That's a hard thing for institutions to do, who presume they're the ones with knowledge and their job is to share it with you. Like, that's a wonderful attitude to have, but when, frankly, most of you are using platforms that none of us on this screen understand until we do what you're doing, which is spend 24 hours a day working with them, there isn't a whole lot to do other than to support you in that effort and see where the experiments go. I mean, I really believe that. I think of of the last 2 or 3 weeks, by far the most depressing day I've had is when one of the schools that I studied in, which happened to be 150 years old up in San Francisco, the San Francisco Art Institute, which is also the home where someone like Kathy Opie learned photography, collapsed. It's gone. It's not like it's gone smaller, it's gone remote. It collapsed because it didn't have the resources and the abilities to support itself. We're going to see more of that over the coming year. Half of the house in arts and architecture at UCLA are public venues. The Hammer Museum, the Fowler Museum, the Center for the Art of Performance. Those are 3 incredibly fragile cultural institutions, but there are also schools in the same kind of space. And I think our shared job is obviously supporting one another and seeing ourselves through a kind of moment like this in which those platforms that exist solely for you have a kind of space in which they can continue to operate.
If somebody wrote after Jesse, please write again because my Zoom crashed for 20 seconds. So if somebody wrote something, got lost. So I ask you to rewrite. In the meantime, Brett, I wanna go back a little bit to you mentioned about that we live. Oh, okay, we have one from Marcelin, so I hold into mind. From Marcelin Gao, Brett. Thank you for the amazing talk, Brett. Wondering if you think Harold Bloom's ideas of influence are still operative in our discipline, or are there other models of revision that are more relevant now?
I don't know Harold Bloom at all. I wouldn't, that wouldn't be my, I wouldn't hold him up as a model for anything. I think literary critics from a generation ago were incredibly important and interesting, particularly within university settings, but no, it's gone. Stay with Instagram or wherever you all live and make that into a radical critical project. It's doable. Kim Kardashian doesn't own the medium. She's just one kind of user of it.
I wanna go back to the things about facts, and clearly we live in a reality that they're not facts anymore, or there are multiple facts at any given time, and of course in this crisis it reveals how dangerous that's it too. But to stick to the conversation of architecture, it's an interesting one because in a way, as a discipline and as an intellectual cultural discipline, we pretend they have been built on the idea of the construction of facts. But the truth is we've been making them up forever. So architects made up facts and we make them paths like realities or truth. And I always find that fascinating because in a way, morally, you can think there's always been a search for the truth. But the fact of the matter, they've always been based on fake alibis. So I find it interesting that we live now in an era in which society and culture finally catch up with architecture historically. I'm not so sure what we should do moving forward because the construction of facts that we were doing, now they are among many other piles of construction that are happening out there. So I'm curious about how we're going to navigate that and what's going to be the reality we're going to have to build to do that.
Yeah. No, I don't know what to say on that. I think other than for it being a reminder to us that how we construct those facts, how we communicate them, how we make images of them, how we broadcast them, how we share them matter arguably more than ever. And while we pursued that kind of a project in the past with an assumption that we needed to talk to 2 distinct audience members, either a client on the one hand, and if you go all the way back to the beginning to a Roman emperor out of which the first architectural monograph is produced to present the facts of the world, to a more recent period, if not clients, the other audience we tended to speak to, you could say, would be, of course, other architects, particularly a next generation of architects that we're trying to bring across to our side. And you know, I think one of the liberating things of a moment like this in which we realize the construction of reality is in and of itself so urgent is that we need to revisit the idea of who our audience might be. i.e., would it be possible to imagine an architectural project or an architect speaking to audiences of the size that other disciplines, including incredibly arcane academic ones, routinely expect they can talk to. So the example I always like to offer on that front is in something like economics. There's 6 people in the Northeast of the United States who can talk to one another at the highest level within that discipline, from Princeton to Columbia to Harvard to Chicago, arguably, who are arguing the nuance of advanced economic theory to one another, but who also routinely, from Krugman to Stieglitz to others, have an expectation that once a year they will sit down and write a book that will be published in the hundreds of thousands to people who are interested in understanding those kind of questions in a different way. I think that's one of the things that we as architects need to get comfortable with. That we can live in a very different that was incredibly support us materially within the profession. I think that there's an argument that can be made that we need to be most forms of communication. It's going to require very different habits and expectations than the ones that we've inhabited for many years.
Do we have any question? Any other question, guys? Yeah, from me. But wouldn't you agree that even the clients no longer are the determinant element in the creation of a project?
Sorry, what was that? I couldn't hear, you glitched.
Yeah, but wouldn't you agree that even the clients no longer are the determinant element in the creation of a project?
I don't know, I don't work for clients. My clients are students, and they are definitely the determinants, as they should be. In terms of those people that that commission architects to do their work, I can't imagine that they aren't still incredibly important. I think the really interesting thing for me on the sort of client side is the ways in which clients go about commissioning, first of all, defining programs and briefs, and then commissioning particular architects to work has entered a very different stage of its own kind of skill levels and expertise. I sit on the boards of a few different architectural offices around the world, and for me, one of the most interesting things in that experience is to watch how offices have taken on the responsibilities they feel like they have to live up to, particularly certain corporate practices today that will map our discipline at levels of detail and development that none of us could imagine, that can sit down and track project histories, trends within careers, fashions within the field, and relate architecture to other design fields, and use that as part of the algorithms that help decide who to commission to do buildings or not. I think there are many examples of it being in a much more familiar form of just enlightened individuals finding talent to work with and wanting to support that. But architecture, of course, sits in this world of development and economic production that also has changed that calculation in huge and interesting ways. And you know, of the students that I've had over the many years in architecture schools that I've had the chance to work with, one of the things that I found incredibly interesting are the careers that are now developing around architects or individuals trained as architects whose job it is to work alongside or sometimes even within those companies and corporations to develop that work that will then ultimately lead to the appointment of architects. And I think, you know, I think it's incredible to imagine schools like SCI-Arc playing a role in that sort of broader education of what we think of as design value and importance, and that some of you might find yourselves not going into a career of serving as designers, but also of operating with incredible design expertise and experience within very different commercial or political settings that then have the opportunity to enable architecture that some of you talk about in your own work today. I think that's an incredibly interesting moment for us.
I think it's 8:10, Brett. I think we'll let you go back to your family. And and whatever else.
I think they're
Thank
probably
you.
on 3 different Zoom screens right now, so I could just dial them in.
Yeah, you can just, I mean, I think this is maybe the way that we move forward. So I want to thank you for joining us. This was a blast to have you. It's always fun. Thank you for taking the time. And I know they're busy days for all of us. So